What's up, suckers? It's me. I'm back with a mic this time. And I wanted to come to you guys a little bit more honestly. I don't even know if honestly is the word that I want to use because I'm always honest. But I wanted to come to you about something a little bit more personal. It is Black History Month. For those of you who have actually been watching me, I'm sure you've noticed I'm Black. And it's been an interesting ride talking about ADHD and talking about ADHD with other Black people and other non-white people. For the most part, we assume that we are not affected any differently with ADHD than somebody who is white with ADHD. But the more that I've thought about it, the more that I've realized there are quite a few things going on, and I'm speaking from the United States here. I don't live in any other country besides Costa Rica, and I don't really have those issues here. So we're talking about the United States when I talk about this stuff. But we have a lot of issues in the United States that I feel exacerbate our usual ADHD symptoms. So I wanted to take this video, to discuss a little bit of my background and a little bit of what I've noticed, and then maybe just a discussion about where we can go from here. So let's start with my background, so you guys know who you're listening to, where I'm coming from. I am actually mixed. I am Puerto Rican, Cuban, and Black. However, I am brown and I grew up in a mostly white area, so I was Black. Also, I didn't speak Spanish at the time, so, Black was what I was. And I was one of maybe, on a good day, 2 or 3 Black people in my classes. At the time, obviously, I did not know that I had ADHD. I did not find out that I had ADHD until 2021. But despite that, I was still considered weird. The signs were still there. I did a video about it. It was still obvious that I was different mentally. It just was also made obvious that I was different physically, which we'll get into in a little bit. Also, I want to make it clear that you are listening to someone who is financially privileged. I grew up in the suburbs, the child of a doctor and eventually a teacher, but she was able to stay home with my brother and I, my mother was, up until we were old enough to move out. So, we didn't really want for much as children. And so I know that I am going to have had certain things at my disposal, certain resources, certain schools that I went to that other people would not have been able to go to. So keep in mind that my story is one of many, and that Black people are not a monolith. So I'm not saying that this is what happens with everyone. This is just what I've noticed. Anyway, these are just a few of the things that I have noticed are probably a little bit worse for people in the Black community because you see it every day. The first being rejection sensitivity, okay? And I just want to make it clear, even though I'm sure that there are plenty of people who either aren't going to hear this and start yelling at me in the comments, or who just aren't really ready to listen. But anytime that you bring up racism, there's this weird response that people tend to have to stuff like this, where we try to pretend that it doesn't exist because it's not overt anymore, right? Like, you can't kick a Black person out of a diner anymore, so therefore racism is dead, without realizing that things that are that pervasive, things that are that much of a way of life, have a way of going underground and have a way of becoming a lot more subtle. So if you are listening to this and you're going to tell me that racism doesn't exist, I'm going to tell you right now that you're wrong, because you're probably still using the definition of racism that existed back in the days before MLK did a lot of the work that he did to change that. So yeah, just wanted to make that clear, that I won't be entertaining any of the racism doesn't exist arguments. So moving on. Rejection sensitivity. Again, I grew up in a mostly white area, and while I was rejected for a number of other reasons, especially in middle school, right? I was considered weird. I was very clingy because I didn't have a lot of friends. I didn't spend a lot of my time doing what most kids did. I preferred to sit and write stories. I was small for my age. I was, very outgoing, but didn't really have the interesting stories to back up being outgoing. I had a lot not going for me at the time, but there were a lot of other little things that I noticed that automatically excluded me when it came to societal norms. The most obvious one, the one that is the easiest for me to bring up, is back when I had hair, before I shaved my head, I would go to the store with my friends and we would go down the hair care aisle, and my friends would be just complaining constantly about how many shampoos there were to choose from and how many conditioners there were to choose from and which ones to pick and which ones were going to make their hair sleek and shiny and perfect and which ones should I pick and which ones have you picked. And they could sit there and have conversations about this stuff. And meanwhile, I would wander to the end of that aisle to the ethnic section, and the ethnic section was like a couple of box texturizers, a few cream relaxers, like one or two brands for hair cream and hair oil and conditioner and shampoo, and that was it. And a lot of people see that and don't think anything of it. It's not racism to them because, nobody's getting called any nasty names or getting anything thrown at them. But there is still a message that is given to a young Black child at that age, basically saying, you are here, but barely. And so you see a lot of little things like that throughout life as a Black kid with ADHD, right? You speak at the same level as the white kids in your class, but you get called loud. If you decide that, going back to the hair thing, my natural hair, you've seen it on this channel, is very curly. I decided to chemically straighten it when I was 12. And the way people's eyes lit up and the way they told me I looked better, the way that boyfriends of mine would tell me that they were so happy that I got my hair straightened because they didn't like to have to try to run their fingers through curly hair because that's impossible. Things like that. I stood out more. So if there were a group of kids that were doing something they weren't supposed to, I tended to attract the most attention and be the one who got in trouble most often. And even now, as an adult, I don't run into it really in Costa Rica at all. But in the United States, I've had people mention that they were surprised to see my white husband with me. I've had people tell me that my natural hair is scary or makes me look scary. Somebody the other day, my son is olive skinned, and somebody thought that I was his nanny. People often don't think that I am his mother. There are so many different situations where society automatically rejects you or excludes you to the point where you kind of just expect to be rejected or excluded regularly. And as it is, people with ADHD are almost always fighting this feeling of, I don't fit in, I'm not the same as everyone else, what is wrong with me? So add on to that you kind of have that going on in your life every day in different ways. The next thing that I thought about was people pleasing and masking. These are things that ADHDers are pretty well known for. People on the autism spectrum as well. We generally want people to like us, right? I mean, that's just kind of a natural want, a natural human need is to be liked and to fit. And when you are in a situation where you kind of already don't fit, especially when I was growing up, there are a lot more instances of people who are Black or non-white who are heroes in movies and are making great music and getting plenty of attention for it. But back when I was a kid, you know, the fact that we had a black Barbie was like amazing. It was we couldn't believe that there was a black Barbie at the time. Otherwise, everything on TV, everything we saw around us did not look like me. And so you already kind of are aware all the time that you're weird, quote unquote, right? You're already aware that you are not the norm. And so you start trying to figure out ways to make up for that so that people will like you. And one of the things that I ran into a lot was that I was taught through a lot of different things to want to try to be one of the quote unquote good ones. And I'm not using that as an exaggeration. Like, someone actually told me once that I was one of the good types of black people because I didn't talk like the ignorant black people. And so I was acceptable. And you might be thinking, wow, that must have really pissed you off. But it didn't. It didn't, because to me, that was a compliment. That meant that I was fitting in, that I was doing something I was supposed to be doing in order to fit in, to please people. That was my own version of masking. And that's why I think sometimes, side rant, that's why I think sometimes it's really interesting when people try to say that they don't see color, or that they can't possibly be racist or have racist thoughts because, you know, I was raised not to be racist. And it's like, bullshit, man. Like, I'm black, okay? And I still hear a lot of the thoughts that I was taught every single day in my head. And if I, the one that those thoughts are built to work against, can't work myself out of that trap, what makes you think you got out of it? What makes you think that you avoided it? You didn't. We didn't. That's the problem. But anyway, going back to people pleasing and masking. So there's a different kind of masking that goes on every day, right? You learn very quickly that speaking up and saying, don't say that about me, that's racist, that's not right, gets you all kinds of nasty labels. You're a troublemaker, right? You're loud, you're too sensitive, you're whiny, which I think is really weird, by the way, because racism is kind of the only thing that I can think of that if you call attention to it, you are accused of being that thing. Like, I've actually had people call me racist for saying that something they said was racist. Like, you know, somebody says that their husband is beating them. Nobody's like, you're being an abuser, Jennifer. Like, why are you making everybody uncomfortable talking about this? Nobody else does that. But for racism, you know, you start realizing you can't mention the things that people are doing wrong to you. Not if you want to please people, not if you want to fit in. So the masking and the people pleasing becomes allowing yourself to be mistreated over and over again. And sometimes it includes helping that mistreatment along, laughing when someone calls you one of the good ones and saying, yeah, I know, hearing someone mention the N-word in your presence and having them say something to the extent of, but that word's not actually racist. It's actually just talking about people who are lazy or slovenly, and not saying, okay, yeah, but that word was originally used to refer to black people, so that was their way of pointing out that people who were black were lazy and slovenly. You don't get to say that stuff. You don't want to say that stuff after a while because you want to fit in. You want people to like you. And it is a different and very pervasive, very deep kind of masking that is hard to separate yourself from, even as an adult, because you've learned that if you don't do that, if you don't mask, if you don't people please, people won't like you. Even more so than the regular ADHD people pleasing, where you learn, not to speak out loud, or to keep your funny little tics under wraps, or, not to tell people about the funny joke that you just heard, not to overshare. It goes even deeper than that, because it's who you are. It's standing up for your right to exist that you wind up pushing away in the name of masking and people pleasing. And just for me personally, I was in a really weird spot where, because I was a mixed kid and because I was growing up in an area that was mostly white, I often ran into a lot of situations where I was not black enough for the black kids, not white enough for the white kids. And so I was kind of masking and people pleasing double time, right? I was agreeing when people would call AAV stupid, but then I also wasn't mentioning that I was into Sugar Cult or Linkin Park when I was around other black people. And it gets exhausting. It's tiring. And masking on its own for every ADHDer is tiring. But when you're not even allowed to drop the mask to be yourself around people who know you, because you're also masking something that is the very core of your being, that's tiring. And it can lead to forgetting who you are. Lastly, because I could go on about this for absolutely ever, is the being called lazy thing. And this is actually more about how the black community treats itself. And this is not just in the black community. Like I said, I'm mixed. I'm black and Hispanic, or black and Latina. So I also get to see this in the Latina community too, where there is an attitude towards any sort of mental difference, because ADHD is not a mental illness. It's a mental difference. But any sort of mental difference that keeps you from being so-called normal is a failure of the parents, of you. It means something negative. And so because it means something negative, because there is a lot less of an acceptance of the concept of mental illness, mental difference, generally you're just going to hear that you're lazy, that you need to try hard enough, that you're not trying hard enough, you need to try harder, that you're going to hear that you're just loud from other people, that you don't pay attention hard enough, that you just need to focus. I still run into that sometimes now, where I will talk to people who are also black or Latino, and I will say, they'll say something about their kid being all over the place or unable to focus, and I will very gently say something along the lines of like, well, I said I couldn't focus, and I thought that I was kind of a space cadet until I realized I had ADHD, and I will get the response, well, they can focus on cartoons, they can do this, they can do that. There's nothing wrong with them. There's nothing wrong with them. They don't have ADHD. Everybody thinks they have ADHD these days. And so, because that stigma has still not been removed from a lot of non-white communities, you still have a lot of non-white kids who don't get diagnosed until they're older, or who refuse to get diagnosed, because that could mean that there's just one more thing that's wrong with them. And to be fair, obviously, there are a lot of societal and financial factors that play into this problem, right? There have been studies that have shown that there's a medical bias towards white and English-speaking families, and that children who are of Black or Latino heritage are more likely to have their actions, their acting out, be attributed to violence more than, possible ADHD. And so you mix that parent's fear of their child being labeled as a problem child or as violent, or fearing that they're not going to be listened to, and the fact that there is a wild earnings discrepancy between non-white families and white families, to the point where they can't afford ADHD medication. And it's kind of a nasty perfect storm. I'm not saying that, that's a stigma that needs to be removed, and that a lot of us in the Black community, if you are Black and you are watching this, that we shouldn't be removing some of those generational curses, so to speak. But there are things that cause those generational curses to exist. For me personally, my parents were a little bit more progressive in this arena, but because I was a gifted and talented kid, and because I learned how to mask really well, I had friends. I didn't, once I got older anyway, when I was in high school. I didn't really have that many friends in middle school. But once I got a little bit older and, I was holding down jobs, I was doing things to the point where my parents assumed that I couldn't possibly have anything wrong with me. I couldn't have a disorder or a mental difference. I was neurotypical, and anything that I said, because I did have moments where I suspected that there was something up, anytime that I said anything that challenged that view, it was not taken favorably, and it was usually argued with. So I didn't exactly escape this problem either. I escaped it enough to be aware that something was up, but not enough to be able to get that diagnosis. So for many years, as a lot of ADHDers, regardless of color, do, I was lazy and flighty and couldn't focus. And that was just who I was. So I know I have talked about race and anti-racism a lot over the years, not on this channel, but in other places. And I know enough to know that the moment that this comes up, it feels icky and uncomfortable, and some people decide to respond to those feelings of ick and discomfort by arguing that everybody goes through this, that this is a problem that everybody has, as if the fact that everybody has this problem somehow makes it okay, even if that is true. Now, I want to be honest and say I cannot attest to what challenges white children with ADHD have. I'm not white. Just like I can't tell you what problems males with ADHD have because I'm not male. But I'd be willing to bet that the problems that black children with ADHD have, that non-white children with ADHD have, are unique to their situation. Because a lot of those exclusions, a lot of the negative language, a lot of the negative messages that are absorbed from the world around them continue societally as if they are normal and acceptable for the rest of their lives. When a little black boy is judged as violent in class because he is all over the place, that continues until he's an adult and sometimes ends in his death. When a black girl tries to say something to a teacher or to a trusted adult or to someone and is told that she's just being loud or finds that her words are discounted, that carries on, and this has been shown, into trying to get doctors to take her medical symptoms seriously. Whether that's because she's a woman or because she's black or because of both remains to be guessed. So many black kids grow up learning that if they don't learn how to sound, and again, more quotes, quote, end quote, more white, that people will not take them seriously. And the behaviors are so ingrained, so taught, so normal in American society that no one really does anything about it or people do feel comfortable arguing that these problems don't exist because they are so subtle. So now imagine that you, a child with ADHD, have spent all of your life, by teachers, by people, when you were a child, you constantly heard that you're lazy, that you can't focus, that you're weird, that you don't fit in. You spent a lot of your time being rejected. And then imagine that you grow up and those lessons, those messages continue. And they continue from all sides, and they're on billboards and in the media and in the way that people react to you, talk to you, treat your appearance. You see these opinions in everything, even in the history books. The lessons that you were taught that made you feel as if you were a failure of a person continue. And not only do they continue, but they continue with little to no argument. And if you happen to bring these things up, you get gaslit into believing that these things don't exist. And somehow, you are expected to still better your emotional dysregulation, your rejection sensitivity, your focus, and a host of other ADHD symptoms. It's a lot harder, you know what I mean? So anyway, before I leave, I did want to kind of talk about moving forward, how things like this can change. And I don't want to pretend that I know everything about this situation. I don't. I just know that this is a foundational issue. It's part of what made me feel uncomfortable and made me want to leave the United States in the first place, is that unless people are willing to work on the faulty foundation, no matter what you build on top of it, it'll never be stable. So one thing that I know can change so much is just changing from the inside and changing yourself. You can't control others, but you can control how you respond. And that can start with paying attention to how you act towards a Black person or a Black child with ADHD. If you catch yourself assuming that a little 7-year-old with ADHD is violent, and that's just who he is, maybe try to catch that and make sure that you're not just jumping to that conclusion in a place where if he was a small white boy, you might think maybe he has ADHD, maybe his problem is that he's bored in class, maybe he has dyslexia, and pay attention to how you speak to children of color with ADHD. And I don't just mean the negative stuff. Like, obviously, I think we can all agree that calling a child of color with ADHD, or a child with ADHD in general, lazy or, weird is fucking vile. I think we can all agree on that. But it's also about the things that you praise. If you praise a child for straightening their hair, right? If you praise them for holding back their personality just because it's quieter, you're essentially teaching that kid that they aren't right the way that they are, and that the only way that they can be accepted is to change all of it, including the things about themselves that really have no impact on them as a person. Brown skin has no impact on that person or on their brain or on who they are. This has been disproven so many times, and yet every time I bring this up, there's always somebody who wants to start talking about how, well, they've proven that Black people are more. No, they haven't. No, they haven't. And don't get me started. If you treat an ADHD child like any other ADHD child, regardless of their skin color, you will get to the bottom of who they are a lot faster. And you also will help them get to the bottom of who they are a lot faster. And for me personally, I'm still working really hard on breaking some of these cycles myself. If I'm honest, I still have days where I look at myself in the mirror and I'm like, I wish I had long hair, or my brown eyes are so boring. I kind of wish that they were blue or gray. I have had to teach myself that the way that I talk is not too much or is not overly loud, and that some people just speak in softer tones than me, and that there's nothing wrong with either one of those things. I have to keep reminding myself every day that I have the right to exist. And I have to keep trying to block out the messages that tell me that I don't. And honestly, that last thing, I wouldn't be surprised to find that every ADHDer can relate to that part. And I just want to say, it takes work. It all does. It all takes work. It's all hard, regardless of your race, your color, your creed, your size. It takes work to work through all of the nasty things that have been built up over the years. And I don't even want to try to pretend that it's going to be fixed in my lifetime or even my kids' lifetime. But you can take little steps. And I think that those in their own way are more important than trying to take big leaps. So thank you for listening. It's the biggest step. And I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you taking this ride with me. Take good care of yourself. Drink plenty of water. And I will see you in the next video or on the next podcast episode.